Calliope inside. I think that's pretty clear. And the idea was that the Calliope would be played as the boat was coming into town. It was an excellent form of advertisement. So the Calliope would play, the townspeople would know, oh, I know that sound, this particular boat is about to land, I better bring my business down to the levee. This same idea was then shortly used for the showboats, starting in about the 1880s. The showboat would come to town, be playing their Calliope, bring all the townsfolk down to the levee, and then they would sell their tickets for the plays that the troupe would put on. Now this was much more effective in the smaller towns, where people would be able to hear the Calliope up to 10 miles away and bring all the farmers and their families down to the river. In the larger cities, the Calliope was considered a nuisance, if you can believe that. So the showboats definitely did better in the smaller towns, the more rural areas along the river up which they were playing. Then, as you start to get around the turn of the century, a new type of steamboating experience comes along, which is the excursion steamboat. Now, there are still people alive these days who may have even taken a trip, an excursion on one of these boats. Names like the Circus family that operated the Capitol and the St. Paul and the Senator and the Sydney and a whole fleet of excursion boats, each of which had its own Calliope. Now, who built these Calliopes? Well, it wasn't still this company out in Worcester, Massachusetts. They basically got out of the business within the first few years because nobody wanted one. However, starting in 1893, a man named Thomas J. Nickel in Cincinnati, Ohio, started building these. And as a matter of fact, just a little side note, through my research, I believe what I found out is he came across a discarded Calliope built back in the late 1850s from the original company, reverse engineered it, and came up with a more economical way of building them. He ended up building about 75 of these instruments altogether. So if someone ever asks you how many Calliopes were there, because of course all of your families are going to want to know, you can tell them there was less than 100 of these really ever built between Thomas J. Nickel, the original company out of Worcester, and then another builder out of Evansville, Indiana named George Crafts. But less than 100 of these instruments built. They would often be sold between circuses and steamboats from one circus to another. So a fun part of the research is actually going and tracking the lineage of each of these instruments as it went from one place to another. Now, by the late 1920s, again, excursion steamboating was starting to die off. There wasn't so much demand for Calliopes, and both of the companies at that time, the Kratz Foundry and the Nickel Foundry, both stopped producing them. So, late 1920s, no one's building Calliopes anymore, and they sort of fall out of favor, as you might imagine. And with the advent of the tourist boats like the Delta Queen and the Mississippi Queen and the American Queen, there was a renewal of interest in these, and a fellow out in Peru, Indiana started building them named Dave Borgcraft. And he sadly passed away a few years ago, but his instruments are just as good as the original Nichols. And I think, Steve, you're going to talk a little bit about this instrument, right? The whistles that are on this instrument were built by Thomas Nickel out of Cincinnati. So I think we're going to get into that a little bit. So part of this instrument is an original Nickel Calliope, which is very exciting for a crazy person like me. So,